We'll read through that, and then we'll just try to kind of unpack the implications of this solemnity. Paul says, "But in fact, Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. For as by a man came death, by a man has come also the resurrection of the dead. For as in Adam all die, so also in Christ all shall be made alive. But each in his own order. Christ the first fruits, then it is coming those who belong to Christ. Then comes the end, when he delivers the kingdom to God the Father, after destroying every rule and every authority and power. For he must reign until he has put all his enemies under his feet. The last enemy to be destroyed is death." And then it skips here down to verse 28. "When all things are subjected to him, then the Son himself will also be subjected to him who put all things under him, that God may be," the RSV here reads, "everything to everyone." That is a very bad translation. The literally in Greek, it's that God may be all in all. So I'm adapting that there. Just because when you say God may be everything to everyone, in our contemporary context, it sounds like, for people who love puppies, God will be a puppy, for people who love chocolate chip cookies, God will be a cookie. That's not what Paul is saying. I don't know why I chose those examples, but there you go. People do like puppies and cookies, but that is not what Paul means. He's talking about God being all in all. It's the universal reign of God over all creation, and in the suffusion, in a sense, of all creation with the power and the life-giving Spirit of God. We'll talk about what that means in just a second. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's back up and just walk through what Paul's getting at in these verses, and then why the church gives us this particular reading for the feast of Jesus Christ, King of the universe. Okay, so a couple things. First, the imagery of first fruits. Here, Paul's taking a standard agricultural image, both from the Old Testament, but also from just Jewish experience in the 1st century AD, and using it as an analogy or a metaphor for the final judgment, for the end of time. So the first fruits was basically the first part of the harvest, whether a harvest of grain, like of wheat or barley in the spring, or the harvest of grapes or fruits in the fall harvest. In the book of Exodus, chapter 23, verse 19, God commands his people to offer him the first fruits of the harvest. So for example, in the spring, when the first sheaves of grain would begin to sprout, they would actually cut down one of those sheaves, and they would bring that sheaf, before they would grind it down and make wheat out of it and eat it themselves, they would bring a offering of the first fruits, which are often the best, and they would give it to God as a sacrifice in the temple. The sheaf offering, sometimes called the Feast of First Fruits, or the offering of the sheaf. And that act of giving God the first fruits of your harvest was basically the agricultural equivalent of a tithe, right? So many people are familiar with tithing. Even if Catholics don't do it, they've heard about their Protestant friends doing it, because it's very popular in Protestant churches to teach the practice of tithing. And that goes back to ancient Israel, in which God would require people to give 10% of their income or revenue or their harvest to him. Like it was a way of taking the first 10% and giving it to God, which is both a kind of sacrifice, it's a kind of act of thanksgiving, right? It's a recognition that everything that we have comes from God, but it's also an act of faith, right? It'd be one thing if, you gave God the last fruits after you made sure your family got fed and you got fed and you paid all the bills. And then once all that's done, then you give God the last fruits. When you give him the first fruits, you're taking the risk that there might not be other fruits, right? And giving him that cut off of the top as a sacrificial offering in faith. So Paul takes that analogy of the first fruits of the harvest, and he says that's what the resurrection is. When Jesus is raised on Easter Sunday, he's the first sheaf of grain that was cut down and now being offered up to God. So his death is like him being cut, and then the resurrection, or the cross, is his offering, sacrificial offering to the Father. But then literally he goes up into the Father's realm, just like the smoke of the sacrifice goes up into the sky, goes up into heaven. So the Paschal mystery is itself a kind of image, or should I say the first fruits is an image of the Paschal mystery of Christ's passion, death, resurrection, and ascension. What Paul's saying then is that Christ is the first fruits of a harvest that will be fully harvested at the resurrection of the dead on the last day. So he's the first offering, and then we are the rest of the harvest. So it's a very powerful image, very cosmic, agricultural image for the resurrection of Jesus. And I think it's important for us to think about it this way, because at least in my experience of teaching, a lot of modern day Christians think of the resurrection primarily, if not exclusively, as like a vindication of Jesus' divinity or a vindication of his messianic identity, right? So people said he wasn't the Messiah, but the resurrection proves that he was. And that's of course true. I mean, that's a dimension of the resurrection, but it's not the fullness of the mystery, because for Paul, the resurrection is much more than just a vindication of who Jesus was. It's also, sorry for the big word, but it's an anti-donation of what is to come. It's a down payment, so to speak, in advance of what God has in store for the rest of humanity who are in Christ. So what happens to Jesus in the middle of time, in the resurrection, will happen to all those who are in Christ at the end of time in the resurrection of the dead, on the last day, on the day of judgment. So the harvest is a perfect image for that, for a first century Jew who's familiar with the stages of harvesting the wheat and offering the first fruits to God and then gathering in the rest, which, by the way, they would also have after that first grain offering, which took place the day after Passover on the day of the sheaf offering, Pentecost, which is 50 days later, was another harvest festival where they would bring in the rest of the sheaves and make another offering to God. So there's a kind of parallel between the offering of Jesus during Passover of himself, and then Pentecost, 50 days later, in a sense represents the gathering in of the nations, the gathering in of the church being offered to God. So it's beautiful and powerful, and I think very helpful way for many modern Christians to think about eschatology, because we're so disconnected from the rhythms, at least especially here in the West. If you live in an industrialized city or society, it's very easy to get disconnected from like the rhythms of planting and harvest and the seasons of the year. But Paul uses those seasons that people are familiar with to explain the mystery of Christ's resurrection and the resurrection of the dead on the last day. That's the first point. Second point is Paul's use of the imagery of Adam and Christ.